Damage is, to absolutely no one's surprise, important. This applies to almost every game, especially including HSR. And so to truly min-max that damage, it's pretty important to know how the damage is actually dealt, and more importantly, how to maximize it. And so here we are. In this video, I'll explain every element in this very daunting formula and some common ways to increase each element. This does not go over break since that uses a different formula, and since I have a decent bit to cover, let's just start before I get sidetracked. First up is the base damage. This one's fairly simple. It's the multiplier of the skill you just used. This is increased with talent level, obviously, and it's literally just the multiplier stated in the talent multiplied by the corresponding stat, usually attack, plus any extra damage. Extra damage here is usually worded as additional damage in game, which refers to things like, say, Tingen's skill or Robin's concerto. It's about as straightforward as you would expect. Next is the crit multiplier. If the hit crits, then it multiplies the damage by 1 plus the crit damage. So if you have 174% crit damage, the crit would do 2.74 times the damage a non-crit would do. As you would expect, the chance for you to crit is just your crit rate stat. This is also a fairly simple one. Now we get to damage boost. Damage boost comes in what I'll call two main forms: elemental damage boost and universal damage boost. Elemental damage boost is what you would expect. It boosts the damage from the element. You get it from usually your orb. Universal damage boost is a little more complicated. While I say universal, I mean more of an all-type damage boost. This form usually boosts a certain kind of damage as opposed to an element, like dot damage or ult damage, or damage against debuffed enemies, or enemies below half health, or whatever. It also boosts all types, like most harmony skills. Usually this is worded as deals more damage or increases damage. There are a ton of sources from this, so I'm not gonna fully list them out. But most commonly are most harmony characters and DPS self-buffs or relic sets. The weaken multiplier is about what you'd expect, and this is a very rare one. There's a total of 3 characters that can do this, being Natasha's technique, Sampo's A6 traits, and Watch's E4. As for enemies, a grand total of 2 enemies inflict weaken on characters, and I bet you didn't even know they do until I told you just now. Now on to defense, which is a little more complicated. I'm gonna focus on the damage that characters deal, so I'll focus on the enemy defense multiplier, which is this mess you see on screen. Since this equation is rather convoluted, I'll cut to the chase and explain how to use this to do more damage. Let's focus on this bit down here. As you can see, defense reduction on enemies and ignore on characters stack up additively. A defense reduction increases damage the more you have until it reaches 100%, in which case it does nothing, since defense can't go negative in this game. The other thing to note is that your character level is in this equation. That means that unless you have 100% worth of defense reduction and ignore, with 100% uptime, you should always level your characters to 80 if you want them to do as much damage as possible. Common sources for defense shred are Pella Alt and Resolution Light Cone. Next up is Res. Res is a stat completely different from defense. Every enemy has varied res for each element. Most enemies have 20% res to all elements they are weak to, 0% to those that they are, and sometimes they have a 40% or 60% res to other elements. Unlike defense, this also goes from negative 100% to 90%, so this can go below 0. Res is the main reason why, even if the enemy isn't weakness broken, attacks against an enemy with that weakness feel like they do more damage. It's because it's a 0% res as opposed to like the 20% res. So at minus 100% res, your attack would do double the damage as it would at 0%. So this is pretty important. The most common source of this, at least for me, is Runmay's ult. Runmay's ult gives, I believe, a 24% res ignore on all characters at level 10, which is pretty huge. Now vulnerability. Vulnerability is actually quite identical to damage boost, except that it's a debuff that's applied to the enemy. Vulnerability is usually worded as increase the damage received by the enemy, not to be confused with increased damage dealt against the enemy. If you need to know more, you can go back to the damage boost chapter. Mitigation is a very rare multiplier, like even rarer than weaken, I think. Most of the time that you encounter it, it's probably from Bootran and the 2-piece God of Wuthering Snow. The 2 non-boss enemies that have it are Decay Shadow, which is a 10% passive damage mitigation at all times, and Shell of Fated Rage, which has 60% when not broken. Lastly, and kind of least, is a broken multiplier. This is just 0.9 when the enemy is not weakness broken and 1 when the enemy is weakness broken. So it's just a 1.1 recurring damage increase when the enemy is broken. It's pretty simple. That's all the multipliers in the damage formula, but there's a pretty important thing to know. Look at the operators between each variable. They're all multiplied together. All of them scale multiplicatively. Basically, what this means is that it often pays more to focus on many different multipliers in this equation as opposed to just one. So that's why people say that Ting Low doesn't really benefit from attack buffs a lot, and what people mean when they say it's saturated. Like when you have a lot of it, you're just focusing on one element of the multiplier, when focusing on a different multiplier is probably more efficient. The only exception to this is death reduction or death ignore, but that one still caps out 100%. And when you do, focus on other multipliers. This was a topic that I kind of just felt like covering one day, so here we are, and hope you enjoyed and found it useful.